11. The law as knowledge. Romans 3, 19-20. Now we know that what things soever the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. Romans 3, 19-20. We must begin by noting Paul's words that the purpose of the law, as it speaks to all men, is that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. Verse 19. We must remember that Paul begins this letter by setting forth the facts of man's inescapable knowledge of God. Men know the things visible and invisible concerning God, in whose image they are created. They know the law of God because they cannot escape knowing God, and the law is the expression of God's being. They are therefore without excuse. Romans 1, 18-23. Paul speaks of the law stopping every mouth and all the world rendered guilty before God. Paul clearly means the law as revealed to Moses and written by Moses. He means equally plainly that this law is known by all men and condemns them all. All men hold or suppress the truth of God in unrighteousness or injustice. Men know that no works of law can save them. As Luther said, "For we are not righteous because we act according to the law, but because we are first righteous, therefore we then fulfill the law." The law speaks to those who are under the law. Calvin said that this means especially the Jews. It would be a serious error, albeit a common one, to restrict the term under the law to Jews and to Christians. The law is covenant law, made with all men in Adam and Noah. All men are either covenant keepers or covenant breakers, but in both cases they are governed by God's law. All covenant breakers will be judged by God's law. Thus, the law is for all men, and all men are under the law. The covenant man, because of Christ's redemption, is no longer under the law as an indictment and a condemnation, but he is under the law as God's way of life for him. The premise of fallen man's life is Genesis 3:5, man's will to be his own God and his own law, to know or determine good and evil for himself. Thus, fallen man is in the heart of his being at war with God. The goal of humanistic history is a kingdom of man under man's law. Thus, Paul says, "Therefore, by the deeds of the law, shall no flesh be justified in his sight." Verse 20. Nothing fallen man can do can justify him, because he is an enmity to God. The good which he does represents a standard of goodness which is alien to God. If at times man's idea of the good has a superficial coincidence with God, it is still at heart at variance. Thus, Freud's approval of marriage as a good solution to the problem of a sexual outlet gives us a radically different morality than does the biblical doctrine. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. Verse 20. If this is true of God's law, how much more so of man's law? All humanistic law orders are attempts at establishing justice without God. The Soviet Union, with its mass murders, tortures, and monstrous evils, is a law order whose goal is Marxist justice, which, in the sight of God, is evil and injustice. The United States and Western European countries, with their quote-unquote equal rights, for homosexuals and the practice of abortion are seeking to establish liberty and justice for all, but they are, in fact, legislating injustice or unrighteousness. The doctrine set forth by Paul is Old Testament teaching. David, whom Paul cites often, is the source of Paul's statement in verse 20. In Psalm 143, verses 1 and 2, David says, "Hear my prayer, O Lord, give ear to my supplications. In thy faithfulness answer me, and in thy righteousness. And enter not into judgment with thy servant, for in thy sight shall no man living be justified." In Ecclesiastes 7:20 we are told, "For there is not a just man upon earth that doeth good and sinneth not." Proverbs 29 tells us, "Who can say, I have made my heart clean, I am pure from sin?" Solomon in 1 Kings 8:46 says, "There is no man that sinneth not." Compare 2 Chronicles 6:36. Paul in Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." And 1 John 1:8 tells us, "If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us." Therefore, Paul makes clear, "There shall no flesh be justified in his sight," verse 20, as Hodge said. To justify is a forensic term, that is, it expresses the act of a judge. Justification is a judicial act. To justify means that either the person is not condemned, or the law declares itself satisfied because restitution or satisfaction has been rendered. Christ's atonement renders satisfaction for us. As very man of very man in his incarnation, he makes restitution or satisfaction for us, and we are justified. Justification is not pardon. It is more. It declares that there can be no punishment because the penalty has been assessed on the person of our representative, Jesus Christ, and the court is satisfied, and we are justified. We are not justified to resume our course of lawlessness, but to assume the law as now our way of life. If we cannot justify ourselves by God's law, how much less can we justify ourselves by apostate man's autonomous law? For the Church to be content with humanistic laws in the states is blasphemous. Neither the states, the Church, nor any other sphere can know the good life in terms of man's law. There is no good apart from God. There can therefore be no good law apart from God. There is no independent realm of goodness which man can appropriate and use. To assume that there is a neutral realm of the good, the true, and the beautiful, which judges both God and man, and which both God and man can use, is impossible and absurd, and also blasphemous. This, Paul tells us, "For by the law is the knowledge of sin." Verse 20. How does man know what is good and evil? From God, who expresses it in his law. How does man know what is sin? He knows what is sin because he knows God's law. Our inescapable knowledge of God means our inescapable knowledge of good and evil, our knowledge of God's law. It's absurd, therefore, to limit God's law to telling me that I'm a sinner. That it does, but it also tells me thereby what justice is. When the law of God tells me that I shall not kill, steal, or commit adultery, it also tells me to regard life on God's terms, use property as a stewardship, and to be content with what is lawfully in my trust, and also to regard marriage as the only God-ordained sexual relationship, one which establishes a community of faith and life. The law gives me knowledge of sin and, at the same time, it gives me knowledge of justice, of righteousness. In so doing, it gives me knowledge of God.